Now we bring you a discussion on Indian maritime security concerns in South China Sea. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Rajesh Lake, anchor. So, a warm welcome, Mr. Wadhwa, to Akashvani.
Thank you.
What is the significance of South China Sea for India, particularly so as we know that India recently sent 3 vessels to Singapore?
The significance of the South China Sea has increased due to Chinese aggressive actions in the South China Sea, especially starting in 2012. In fact, between 2012 and 16, the Chinese took unilateral actions according to the 9 line, which they have propagated for some time, on top of the 10 line that the Taiwanese have propagated because of the disputes that countries in the South China Sea have on their jurisdiction over certain territories and islands in the South China Sea. And India has got involved in the South China Sea because of the threat Chinese actions pose to freedom of navigation and overflight and freedom of passage, since a large percentage of world trade and a large percentage of India's exports pass through the South China Sea. Therefore, India, like many other like-minded countries, would not like that there should be some kind of curbs through artificial claims on the South China Sea or within the South China Sea, especially since many of these claims are based on man-made structures that have come up after the Chinese actions. Therefore, there is also a growing presence of the United States and other countries in the region. And the South China Sea has become a sort of flashpoint which requires careful monitoring going forward. India has now sent, as you rightly mentioned, 3 naval ships to Singapore. That's supposed to be part of its graduated involvement in the South China Sea under the current government. And before that, if you remember, India had also offered to provide helicopters to the Philippine Coast Guard amidst rising tensions between Philippines and China, which had raised some concerns in China, wondering whether India could become a new troublemaker, as they called it in inverted commas, a label which is generally applied to the United States in the South China Sea. The other issue to note here is that India has enhanced its military and diplomatic engagement with the claimant states such as Philippines and Vietnam, and it is likely that India will further expand its presence in the South China Sea, and that would put some kind of a pressure on China to abide by international rules as laid down by UNCLOS, which China does not exist. This is therefore the whole significance or the background of the South China Sea issue.
What you just mentioned is that for the decision makers, the growing importance of the region for trade and connectivity is extremely important. With over 55% of India's trade passing through the South China Sea, maritime security has become more important for New Delhi than ever before. So what measures are being taken, Mr. Wadhwa, to ensure the security aspect from India's point of view?
India has been expanding its defense cooperation with the claimant states in the South China Sea and has actually moved away from its previous neutral stance, if we may call it that, when in 2016 there was arbitral tribunal award on the South China Sea. India has greatly since then deepened its involvement in the disputes. So in May 2019, for example, the Indian Navy for the first time conducted joint exercises with the US, Japan, and Philippine navies in the South China Sea. And 1 year later, the Indian Navy held military exercises with the navies of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Australia, and Indonesia. This happened in August of 2021. Then in May 2023, now we see this incident where for the first time, warships are being sent to participate in the 2-day joint exercise with the navies of 7 ASEAN states in the South China Sea. And thereafter, now in 2024, which you already mentioned, we have sent 3 of our ships to Singapore. So India has also significantly increased its military sales and assistance to the Philippines and Vietnam. In January 2022, India reached a deal with the Philippines for the export of 100 BrahMos supersonic anti-ship missiles. In June 2023, Vietnam became the first country to receive a fully operational light missile frigate from India. And, when tensions had spiked between China and the Philippines over confrontation in the South China Sea, India announced that it would offer the Philippines at least 7 helicopters that would be used for the rescue and humanitarian efforts of the Philippines Coast Guard during natural disasters. So while the primary focus on boosting search and rescue capabilities remains, I think, as pointed out by the Philippine president himself, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the helicopters would be a big contribution for the Philippines Coast Guard's maritime operations in general. So we see this shift which has subtly been happening over the years. And one major shift also which comes to notice to my mind is that at the India Philippines Foreign Ministers meeting, which was held at the end of June 2023, India abandoned its previously cautious stance and instead Indian Philippines underlined the need for the peaceful settlement of disputes and for adherence to
Correct.
international law, especially UNCLOS and the arbitral award in the joint statement. So this was the first time that India proposed abiding by the award, indicating what I would think is a significant shift in India's neutral stance on the South China Sea disputes.
Very rightly mentioned. As you mentioned, Mr. Vadva, maritime domain has become important since over 90% of world's trade is carried by sea. Now, I'm going to ask you about the sea lines of communication in Southeast Asia, which account for roughly about 15% of the total volume of world trade. Transits have been facing with security challenges, and those challenges have significantly impacted on the maritime security, maritime safety, and even the international relations in the region. Now, piracy and armed robbery at sea in Southeast Asian region has been named more common than any other location worldwide. And apart from that, illegal, unreported and unregulated IUU fishing is a problem which has impinged on relations between states in the region. We would like you to throw light on those as well.
You rightly mentioned that IUU fishing and human and arms and drugs trafficking are necessitating development of fresh paradigms in maritime security right now. And piracy and armed robbery at sea have flared up in new regions over the past decade. They remain a significant threat to international shipping and seafarers, and therefore unregulated activities, I would call them, pose considerable challenge. So these are all what our Navy considers gray areas of concern. And in terms of what is happening in the South China Sea, there has been threat to maritime tourism, piracy, also robbery, and IUU fishing, which has been quite prevalent in this region in the past. Now, this was overshadowed a little bit what is happening in the Red Sea, for instance, and what is happening across the coast of Africa in recent times, where the Indian Navy has been particularly involved, and therefore we don't hear much about what is happening in the South China Sea in this respect. In the context of South China Sea, it is more now a direct competition and confrontation which is faced by the US and the Chinese navies. And of course, the recent dispute which has arisen between the Chinese and the Philippines navies. So, in all this, we find that there is an explosive mixture of traditional and non traditional threats to security. Therefore, maritime domain awareness becomes extremely important. And India is part of an arrangement for maritime domain awareness where monitoring of ships can be done real time through the monitoring centers which have been set up in Gurugram, near New Delhi, and also in Singapore, for instance. And more such centers will come up in the future. Now, there are groupings like the Quad. There are informal groupings of countries who are like minded, who are concerned about these issues, who have joined these maritime monitoring centers. And India is very much part of it and is in the thick of it. So, going forward, I think India's involvement would only increase in this situation. And the Indian Navy is actually looking at now inducting new technical means into the setup, including an improvised version of minesweepers, for instance, because there's a deficiency of them. And also the fact that they will start acquisition of new platforms and building new platforms in the near future in order to augment the strength of the Indian Navy.
So, how do you assess the role of international law, particularly UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, in addressing maritime disputes with China in the South China Sea?
The main reason for this tension which has arisen is the fact that China refuses to abide by the United Nations Convention of Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, and actually relies on its traditional claims or historical claims, as it calls it, which has been deemed to be an illegal stand by UNCLOS. And there was an arbitral award which was given in 2016. So China refuses to abide by that. This award was given when the Philippines went to the tribunal seeking a ruling on this. And India at that point was quiet. It was not taking a strident stand on it. But as I said earlier, I think the developments in the South China Sea have been such that India has been forced to take a clear stand now and is supporting the Philippines in the recent confrontation which has happened, and is also supporting the stand of the Philippines because of the legality on which it is based. Now, as far as China is concerned, it has tried, or at least it has engaged the ASEAN countries in what we call a code of conduct. But many feel that the Chinese have dragged this on for too long in order to consolidate their own position. And secondly, there are two insurmountable problems in the negotiations now, where the Chinese want to keep out what they call extra-regional powers from any arrangement, which means countries like United States, but also includes India, for instance, or Japan or Australia for that matter. And that is not a possibility because this is a region from where international trade passes. And these countries obviously cannot accept this situation going forward. Secondly, the ASEAN themselves feel that they should not be constrained into taking such a position. And the Chinese want to discuss these issues individually with the ASEAN countries, whereas the ASEAN wants to communicate and to discuss these issues as a group. So that's where we are stuck. There's no code of conduct in the South China Sea. And meanwhile, the US presence and others' presence in the region is also increasing. Freedom of navigation operations are also increasing because of Chinese actions. And so now we see also the presence of the European Union to a certain extent in the region.
Okay, so in that context, I would like to ask you, what should be the strategy from India's point of view, and what collaborative efforts, you mentioned Europe, you mentioned America, if any, do you think India should pursue with other countries or regional organizations to address maritime security challenges in the South China Sea?
I think I see three major future trends. First of all, I think India's presence in the South China Sea issue will expand. First, due to the growing trade and investment connections and defense cooperation that India has with the ASEAN states. So India would have a stronger motivation to be involved in the South China Sea issue. And of course, this would complicate the South China Sea disputes as far as China is concerned. But India would definitely like to offset China's advantages in the Sino-Indian border also by manipulating the South China Sea issue to some extent. And in fact, this is why we see a growing involvement of India in the South China Sea dispute sharply since May 2020 clashes with China in the Galwan Valley. And obviously, this issue will be used to restrain China's strength on the border because any incident here could then involve an Indian response, not at the moment, but maybe in a few years in the South China Sea as well. Thirdly, I think there is now a close relationship that India has with the United States, and we have an involvement with the Quad on one hand, and also there is a support that India receives through information sharing as far as the dispute with China on the border is concerned. I think there will be an ongoing confrontation between China and the United States in which India would not hesitate to seize any opportunity which benefits us from this situation.
Thank you so much for showing all the possibilities as per, what is happening in the current situation regarding maritime security in the South China Sea. Thank you for being with Akashvani.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on Indian maritime security concerns in South China Sea. The participants were Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Rajesh Lake, anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on a YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.
ये है आकाशवाणी और आप सुन रहे हैं गोल्ड 100.8